The silence was the first thing that truly registered, the first thing that felt real after the years of fabricated noise in Philadelphia. It wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a presence. A heavy velvet curtain dropped over the world. It pressed in on the ears, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. For the first week, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced something was wrong. It took me that long to realize the alarm bell ringing in my subconscious was just the lack of sirens, of shouting from the street below, of the perpetual grinding hum of a city that never slept. Chloe loved it instantly. "It's honest," she'd said, standing on the slightly slanted porch of our new, ridiculously cheap two-story house. She spread her arms wide, a queen surveying her quiet kingdom. "You can hear the world breathe out here, Liam." I wanted to believe her. I needed to. My career as an investigative journalist hadn't just burned me out. It had incinerated me, leaving behind a husk of cynicism and a scandal that had made my name toxic in any newsroom east of the Mississippi. This house, this plot of land in rural Oregon, a stone's throw from a town called Harrow Creek that was little more than a post office and a general store, was our last stand. We'd poured every last cent of our savings into it. The realtor, a slick man with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, had explained away the bargain basement price with phrases like motivated seller and a bit of a fixer-upper. We didn't care. We saw peeling paint and saw potential. We saw isolation and saw peace. The first few weeks were an idol pulled from a Rockwell painting. Chloe claimed the large, dilapidated barn out back, its weathered wood the color of old bones. Soon the sounds of her potter's wheel joined the whisper of the wind in the tall Douglas firs that bordered our property. She was radiant, her hands perpetually smudged with clay, her laughter echoing in the vast open space. I tried to find my own rhythm. I started a blog, a pathetic attempt to pivot from exposing political corruption to chronicling the joys of rustic living. I wrote about fixing leaky faucets and the surprising aggression of local blue jays. It felt like lying, but it was a necessary lie. We were building a new life, one stud and one blog post at a time. It was during a walk in the bruised light of dusk about a month in that we found him. He was lying just inside the tree line where our overgrown lawn met the deep, perpetual shadow of the forest. A big dog, the color of a new penny, with the powerful build of a Ridgeback mix. He didn't move as we approached, just watched us with eyes that were too old, too intelligent for a stray. A dark, ugly gash marred his flank. It was deep and jagged, not the clean tear of a tooth or claw. It looked as though he'd been scraped against something sharp and serrated, like a shard of broken metal. "Oh, you poor thing," Chloe whispered, dropping to her knees without a hint of fear. I hung back. "Chloe, be careful. He could have rabies, anything." The dog didn't even lift its head. It just exhaled. A long, weary sigh, and its gaze remained fixed on us. It wasn't a look of aggression or fear, but of profound exhaustion, of assessment. Chloe's mind was already made up. "We are not leaving him here to die, Liam." The town's only vet, a gruff old man named Doc Hemlock, pursed his lips as he cleaned the wound. "Damnedest thing," he muttered, more to himself than to us. "Doesn't look like any bite I've ever seen. Or a snare. Almost looks like... well, hell if I know what it looks like." He stitched the dog up with practiced efficiency, gave him a battery of shots, and accepted our cash with a grunt. We named him Copper. He healed with an almost unnatural speed. The wound that should have taken weeks to close was a puckered pink scar in a matter of days. He slotted into our lives as if he'd always been there. He was quiet, impeccably behaved, and asked for nothing but a place to lie and the occasional scratch behind the ears. But he had his quirks. The most notable was that he never barked. Not once. He didn't chase squirrels. He didn't yelp at passing cars on the distant main road. He was a silent, watchful presence, a copper statue in our home. His other quirk was the forest. He would spend hours on the porch perfectly still, his body aimed at the dark wall of trees like a compass needle pointing north. He wasn't relaxed. He was on duty. Every so often, a low, guttural growl would vibrate in his chest, a sound that seemed to come from a place deeper and older than his own body. When he did this, the faint ridge of hair along his spine would bristle, standing up in a perfect, sharp line. He wasn't watching for deer or rabbits. He was watching for something else. The first sign appeared on a Tuesday morning. The ground near the tree line was still soft from an overnight shower. Chloe saw it first, calling me over with a tremor in her voice. There, pressed deep into the mud, was a single, perfect print. It was long, maybe 14 inches from heel to tip, and narrow. It had 3 long toes, each ending in a deep gouge that suggested a formidable claw. It wasn't the track of a bear, which is what I immediately tried to tell myself. A bear's print is wide, 5-toed, almost human. This was alien, avian, and reptilian at once, something that had no business being in an Oregon forest. "What in God's name is that?" Chloe breathed, hugging herself. "It's a coyote, maybe," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "A big one. Or a bear with a deformity." I was grasping at straws, my old journalistic habit of seeking the most logical, if improbable, explanation. But I didn't believe it. The print was too clean, too deliberate, too wrong. A chill, unrelated to the morning air, snaked its way up my spine. Chloe's idyllic peace was beginning to fray. That night, for the first time since we moved in, I heard the click of the locks on all the downstairs windows. She was trying to be quiet, but in the profound silence of our new home, the sound was as loud as a gunshot. I lay in bed, listening to the house settle around us, and for the first time, I felt it too. The unnerving sensation of being watched from the oppressive darkness of the trees. Our quiet haven was starting to feel like a cage. The unsettling became the routine. The tracks were no longer an anomaly. They were a statement. Every other morning, we'd find a new set. They were never a full trail, just a short, exploratory line of 3 or 4 prints. They'd emerge from the forest's edge, march 10 or 20 feet into our property, and then simply stop, as if the creature that made them had been plucked straight up into the sky. It was studying us, mapping the perimeter. Copper's nights became a low, rumbling vigil. He'd forsake his comfortable bed by the fireplace, choosing instead to lie before the front door, a silent, tense guardian whose occasional growls were the only proof that we weren't imagining things. Then came the sounds. They started subtly, easy to dismiss as the house settling or the wind in the branches. A soft scraping against the roof shingles, like a heavy bough dragging across them. But soon, they grew bolder. A loud, sharp crack from the woods in the dead of night, the unmistakable report of a tree limb the thickness of a man's thigh being snapped in two. It was followed by a low, resonant hum, a vibration that seemed to emanate not from the air, but from the very ground beneath the house. It was a bass note so deep you felt it in your teeth and bones more than you heard it with your ears. Chloe was becoming a ghost in our new home. The vibrant artist who had practically danced into the barn was replaced by a pale, drawn woman who jumped at every creak of the floorboards. Dark circles bloomed under her eyes. "It knows we're here, Liam," she said one evening, her voice thin and reedy. "It's waiting." I couldn't dismiss it anymore. My own carefully constructed wall of logic was crumbling, eroded by the nightly hum and the impossible tracks in the morning dew. I needed answers, or at least a different perspective. There was only one person to ask. Our nearest neighbor, a man named Alistair Finch, lived on a farm a mile down the winding dirt road. We'd waved to him once as he drove past in his ancient Ford pickup, and he'd responded with a curt, barely perceptible nod. He was our only option. I found him mending a fence post, his back to the road. He was a wiry old man, his skin tanned to the consistency of well-worn leather, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue. He didn't seem pleased to see me. "Help you with something?" he asked, not bothering to stop his work. "Hi, I'm Liam Caulfield. My wife and I, we just bought the old Madigan place." Finch paused, his hammer hovering in midair. He slowly turned to look at me, and his expression was grim. "That's so. Yeah. Look, I know this is going to sound strange, but have you ever heard any unusual noises at night? Or seen any strange tracks around here?" The change in him was instantaneous. The flinty annoyance was replaced by a deep, weary darkness. He set his hammer down and leaned against the fence post, his gaze drifting towards the distant silhouette of my house against the trees. "The Madigans didn't move," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly tone. "They vanished. One day, Tom's truck was in the drive. The lights were on. Dinner was half-eaten on the table. The next, they were just gone. Tom, his wife, their little girl. Poof." My stomach tightened. The realtor said they moved back east. Finch let out a short, bitter laugh. The realtor wanted his commission. Police came out from the city, nosed around for a week, found what they called signs of a struggle in the living room. A smashed lamp, an overturned table, but no bodies, no blood to speak of, no ransom note. Eventually, they decided the Madigans must have skipped town on account of some debts. Easier than admitting they didn't have a goddamn clue. He picked up a stray piece of baling wire, twisting it in his gnarled fingers. "Locals know better, that land. It's wrong. Spoiled. The tribes that used to live around here, they wouldn't go near it. Said it was a place where the ground was thin. A place for rituals. Bad ones." A cold dread, sharp and acidic, rose in my throat. "What do you mean, spoiled?" "I mean," he said, fixing me with his pale eyes, "that Tom Madigan got it in his head there was something under that house of yours. He was a good man, but he got obsessed. Started talking crazy the last few months before they disappeared. Said he heard voices, felt a vibration, started digging in his own basement." The word vibration hit me like a physical blow. The hum, the deep subterranean thrumming that shook the fillings in my teeth. It wasn't my imagination. "This is going to sound crazy," I began, my voice hoarse, "but we've been hearing it too. And the tracks." "3 toes?" Finch asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Long like a bird's, but heavy, with claws that dig deep?" I just stared at him, unable to speak. He nodded slowly, a grim finality in the movement. "It's woken up again. Or maybe it never went back to sleep. You listen to me, son. You and your wife need to pack your bags and leave. Don't sell the house. Don't wait for your money back. Just get in your car and drive until you can't see those woods in your rearview mirror. Some places aren't meant for people. The drive back was a blur. Finch's words echoed in my head, a grim counterpoint to the logical explanations I was still desperately trying to formulate. A local legend, a wild animal, a prankster with a twisted sense of humor. But it all felt hollow. The story of the Madigans, the details of Tom's obsession, the description of the tracks. It was too specific, too terrifyingly aligned with our own experience. That night, the sounds were worse than ever. The scraping on the roof was no longer tentative. It was a harsh, rhythmic scratching, as if something was deliberately trying to claw its way through the shingles. The hum from below was a constant, malevolent presence. But there was a new sound, one that turned my blood to ice. Thump, thump, thump. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the house. They were slow, weighty, each one pressing into the soft earth with purpose. "Liam!" Chloe sobbed from beside me in the bed, her body rigid with terror. "It's outside. It's right outside." My reporter's instincts, the part of me that runs toward the fire, warred with a primal urge to hide under the covers like a child. The reporter won, just barely. I grabbed the heavy 4-cell mag light from the nightstand and the iron poker from the fireplace. My heart felt like it was trying to batter its way out of my chest as I crept to the front door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. Just the familiar porch, bathed in the cold blue light of the security lamp. Taking a deep breath, I wrenched the door open and stepped out onto the porch, the poker held in front of me like a clumsy sword. The night was still and silent. No wind, no sound. I swept the powerful beam of the flashlight across the yard, the light cutting a sharp cone through the darkness. Nothing. No hulking beast, no grinning prankster. Just a fresh set of tracks, a line of them, leading from the dark maw of the forest. 3-toed, deep-gouged, monstrous. They ended less than 3 feet from where I was standing, right at the bottom step of the porch. It had been right here, watching, listening. The journalist in me, the one I thought was dead and buried, clawed its way back to the surface. Fear was a paralytic, but facts were a weapon. If I couldn't fight what was outside my house, I could at least try to understand it. The next morning, leaving a pale and silent Chloe to her work in the barn, her fortress, I drove into Harrow Creek. The town archive was a single dusty room in the back of the library, presided over by a woman whose glasses were as thick as the bottom of a Coke bottle. I asked for the local paper archives from the year the Madigans had disappeared. She led me to a clunky microfiche reader that hummed and whirred like a dying insect. After an hour of scrolling through grainy pages of bake sale announcements and high school football scores, I found it. A small article, buried on page 4. Local family of 3 vanishes. Foul play not ruled out. The article was short on details, mentioning the police investigation was ongoing and that neighbors reported the family had become reclusive in the months prior. It was a dead end. My next stop was the county records office. I requested the original plat maps and building surveys for my property. After another hour of sifting through brittle, yellowed documents, I found something that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was an old survey map from the late 1800s. Our parcel of land was marked clearly, but where our house now stood, there was a different label, written in elegant, spidery cursive, Old Hope Mine. Collapsed 1888. A mine. Under my house. Alistair Finch's words about Tom Madigan digging in his basement slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. Fueled by a new, frantic energy, I spent the afternoon tracking down the sheriff who had handled the Madigan case. I found him, a man named Jedediah Banks, living in a small retirement community 1 town over. He was hesitant to talk at first, the case clearly a sore spot in an otherwise placid career. But when I mentioned the mine and the vibrations, he sighed and waved me into a chair on his sun-drenched porch. "That case," he said, staring off into the distance, "it'll haunt me till I die. We treated it like a standard missing persons, but it was never standard. Tom Madigan, he wasn't right in the head at the end. Came into my office a week before he vanished, rambling about voices. Said they were coming from the floor, whispering to him." "Did you check the basement?" I asked, my voice tight. "Oh yeah," Banks nodded. "That's where it got really weird. He'd torn up half the concrete floor with a sledgehammer, and underneath, he'd started a tunnel. A crude thing, just a hole dug with a shovel, really. Maybe 10, 12 feet deep. It just ended in dirt and rock. We figured he'd hit a dead end and given up. Or maybe his wife finally put a stop to his madness." The sheriff shook his head. "We wrote it off as a symptom of his breakdown. Never connected it to the old mine shaft. Never even knew one was there." That night, I fell down a different kind of rabbit hole, the internet. I typed Paranormal Oregon and Harrow Creek strange events into search bars, wading through pages of blurry UFO photos and Bigfoot sightings. Then I found it, a small, obscure forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena in the Pacific Northwest. In a thread from 5 years ago titled, "My Cousin's Strange Obsession," an anonymous user laid out a story that mirrored what Sheriff Banks had told me, but with more chilling detail. User_42, "My cousin Tom, Madigan, became convinced there was something buried under his house, not treasure. He called it an ancient passage or a tomb. He said it sang to him at night. He spent all his money on old maps and geological surveys. Said the original miners in the 1880s didn't just find silver, they found a void. He was trying to dig his way back into it when he and his family disappeared. Everyone thinks they ran from debt, but I know better. That house, that land, it took them." I read the post to Chloe. She just wrapped her arms around herself, her face ashen. The last vestiges of my skepticism were gone, vaporized. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern, a blueprint for a nightmare that we were now living. The final piece of proof came the next day. I had meticulously cleaned the porch the night before, determined to catch our visitor in the act. But there they were again. 3 perfect, 3-toed prints, pressed into the damp wood of the top step. They weren't muddy. They were just impressions. As if an immense invisible weight had been placed there. It was a taunt, a deliberate act of psychological warfare. That was it. I drove to the nearest electronics store and bought a wireless trail camera, the kind hunters use, with a high-sensitivity motion detector. I mounted it discreetly under the eaves of the porch, aiming it to cover the steps and the path leading to them. I was done with legends and stories. I wanted evidence. I wanted to see the monster. The next morning, my hands were trembling so violently I could barely operate the laptop. Chloe stood behind me, her hand gripping my shoulder. I clicked on the file for the previous night's recordings. Most of it was just hours of empty black and white footage of the porch. Wind rustling the leaves, a moth fluttering past the lens. Then, at 3:14 a.m., the timestamp glowing in the corner of the screen, it happened. The air directly above the stone path began to shimmer, a subtle distortion like heat haze rising from summer asphalt. It lasted only a second. Then, in the spot where the air had warped, a deep 3-toed print appeared in the soft dirt. Just appeared, pushed down from above by nothing. A second later, the air shimmered again, a few feet closer to the steps, and another print materialized out of thin air. Then another and another, marching up the path, up the steps, right to our front door. There was no creature, no body, no physical form. Just the laws of physics being casually, terrifyingly violated on our front lawn. I slammed the laptop shut. Chloe let out a choked sob. We stared at each other, the same thought screaming in both our minds. This wasn't an animal, this wasn't a person. This was something else entirely. Something impossible. "We have to go," I said, my voice a ragged whisper. Chloe nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Now. We have to go now." The debate was over. The investigation was over. The only thing left to do was run. We would pack what we could, get in the car, and drive. We'd abandon the house, the money, the dream of a quiet life. We'd abandon it all just to see the sun rise tomorrow, somewhere, anywhere else. Our last day was a blur of frantic, panicked activity. We moved through the house like ghosts haunting our own lives, throwing clothes, documents, and keepsakes into cardboard boxes with no sense of order. The air was thick with unspoken fear. Every floorboard that creaked, every rustle of leaves outside the window, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through us. We were prey, and we knew the predator was close. Copper never left our side. He shadowed our every move, a silent, tense presence. His body a coiled spring. Every few minutes he would stop and stare at the front door, the one that led towards the forest, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He knew what was coming. We worked too slowly. The afternoon bled into a bruised purple twilight, and we were still not ready. And then the sky, which had been clear all day, turned on us. Dark, heavy clouds rolled in from the west with an unnatural speed, swallowing the remaining light. The first fat drops of rain splattered against the window panes. Within minutes, it was a full-blown thunderstorm, a torrential downpour that hammered against the roof and walls, the sound of it an oppressive, deafening roar. It was as if the world itself was trying to keep us here. The lights flickered once, twice, then died with a final, pathetic buzz. We were plunged into a primal darkness, the only light coming from the frequent, stark flashes of lightning that illuminated the room in ghostly stop-motion detail. Chloe let out a small, terrified whimper. I fumbled for the emergency candles and a lighter, my hands shaking. The flickering, dancing flames cast long, distorted shadows that writhed and writhed on the walls. Through the cacophony of the storm, a new sound emerged. It was quiet at first, but sharp, methodical. Scrop, scrop. It came from the front door, a sound like a garden rake being dragged slowly, deliberately across the wood. My blood ran cold. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was patient. It was intelligent. Then came the first impact. Thump. It wasn't a frantic pounding, but a heavy, deadweight blow, as if something was leaning its full mass against the door. Chloe cried out, scrambling back from the living room entrance. Copper planted himself firmly between us and the door. The low growl in his chest erupted into a furious, desperate volley of barks, a sound we had never heard from him before. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated rage. Thump. Another blow, harder this time. The whole door frame shuddered. My mind raced. The trail camera. I snatched my laptop from a half-packed box, flipped it open, and clicked on the live feed. The camera's infrared lens cut through the darkness, rendering the porch in a grainy, monochromatic hellscape. The rain was a streaking, ghostly curtain. For a moment, I saw nothing but the storm. Then, just as on the recording, the air in front of the door began to shimmer. The three-toed tracks materialized on the porch boards, water sizzling as they pressed down into the wood. But this time it didn't stop there. The shimmering distortion didn't vanish. It intensified, coalesced, pulling the darkness and the rain into itself until it began to take shape. My breath caught in my throat. I was looking at the monster. It was tall, impossibly tall and thin, its desiccated frame looking like a starving scarecrow stretched over a frame of broken branches. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at unnatural angles. The skin, a patchwork of what looked like tanned, leathery hide, was pulled so taut over its bones that it had split in places, revealing glimpses of blackened, stringy muscle beneath. Its head was elongated and completely hairless, dominated by a gaping, jawless mouth filled with rows of tiny, needle-like teeth. It had no visible eyes, just smooth, sunken pits of shadow. It wasn't looking at the camera. It didn't need to. It raised one of its horrifyingly long arms and placed a three-fingered hand, claws extended, flat against the center of our door. The sound of Copper's barking abruptly ceased. In the sudden, ringing silence, punctuated only by the storm and my own ragged breathing, the dog did something that shattered the last remnants of my understanding of the world. He turned his head, his intelligent eyes locking with mine, and from his throat, in a clear, low, and terrifyingly human voice, he spoke. "It is here." The world seemed to hold its breath for a single, infinite second. Then, with an explosive crack that sounded like a rifle shot, the deadbolt and the lock assembly on the front door shattered, wood and metal spraying into the room. The door swung violently inward, slamming against the wall. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the storm, stood the thing. Its featureless face turned toward us, and from the deep shadowed pits where its eyes should have been, 2 points of faint phosphorescent light flickered to life, fixing on us in the candlelit dark. Panic is a cold, sharp thing. It bypassed my brain and shot straight into my limbs, locking them in place. My horror was twofold, a paralyzing paradox. The desiccated nightmare standing in my doorway, and the calm human voice that had just come from my dog. I didn't know which was more terrifying. The creature in the doorway let out a low gurgling sound like mud bubbling up from a deep well and took a ponderous, scraping step into our house. "This way, now!" Copper's voice, sharp and urgent, cut through my paralysis. He wasn't looking at the monster. He was looking at us. With a final defiant snarl at the intruder, he spun and bolted not toward the back of the house, but toward the kitchen. Instinct took over where reason had failed. I grabbed Chloe's arm. She was frozen, her face a mask of pure catatonic terror, and pulled her with me, stumbling after the dog. Behind us, I heard the crash of our coffee table splintering, followed by a heavy, dragging shuffle. The thing was faster than it looked. Its steps were ungainly but covered ground with horrifying speed. The gurgling sound was closer now, a wet, hungry noise that promised unspeakable things. Copper was a blur of motion ahead of us. He didn't slow as he reached the back of the kitchen, instead using his body to slam open the flimsy utility room door. He scrabbled at the main back door, and I fumbled with the lock, my fingers slick with sweat. The door flew open, and we burst out into the lashing, ice-cold rain. The backyard was a churning sea of mud. We ran, slipping and sliding, following the copper-colored streak that was our guide. The roar of the creature echoed behind us, a sound of pure fury and frustration. It was no longer gurgling, it was screaming, a high, thin shriek that tore through the noise of the storm. I didn't dare look back. I could hear it crashing through the azalea bushes that lined the house, the sounds of snapping wood and tearing foliage terrifyingly close. We plunged into the tree line, the familiar forest now a terrifying, disorienting maze of black trunks and whipping branches. Copper led us on, his form a ghostly flicker in the strobing lightning, moving with a certainty that defied the darkness. Just as my lungs began to burn and I thought I would collapse, the trees suddenly fell away. We were standing on the edge of a large clearing, dominated by the skeletal, rusting husk of a massive industrial building. Its corrugated metal walls were peppered with broken windows, like vacant eyes staring out into the storm. The old ore processing factory, the one connected to the Old Hope mine. Copper didn't hesitate. He took a running leap and sailed through a shattered window frame on the ground floor, disappearing into the cavernous darkness within. We scrambled after him, tumbling onto a concrete floor littered with debris and slick with rainwater. And as soon as I was inside, it started. My vision flickered. For a split second, the derelict factory was filled with spectral figures. Gaunt, grimy men in overalls, holding pickaxes and lanterns. I heard their voices, not as sounds, but as thoughts implanted directly into my brain. Found a hollow space. A void. The vibration. God, that vibration again. Tom's gone mad, just keeps digging. They weren't memories. They were echoes, psychic stains left on the very fabric of the place. Then, a single, vivid image burned itself onto the inside of my skull. I saw Tom Madigan, his face wild with a terrifying, ecstatic madness, standing at the edge of a newly dug pit in the center of the factory floor. He was being lowered into the blackness on a crude rope and pulley system. And then, from the depths of that hole, came a chorus of inhuman screams, a wet, tearing sound, and that same foul, gurgling noise we had heard in our house. My God. The realization hit me with the force of a physical impact. The creature wasn't something that had killed Tom Madigan. The creature was Tom Madigan, or what was left of him after he'd found his ancient passage. A deafening roar from the tree line snapped me back to the present. The creature burst into the clearing. It didn't bother with the broken window. It simply tore a new entrance for itself, ripping through the rusted metal wall as if it were wet cardboard. It stood there for a moment, its glowing eyes scanning the cavernous space, before it locked onto us. "Here!" Copper barked, his real voice this time, and nudged my leg with his head. He was standing beside the very pit I had seen in my vision. But next to it, partially hidden by a large, rusted sheet of iron, was a narrow, dark opening. A maintenance tunnel, maybe. Copper clawed at the iron sheet, pushing it aside to reveal a black, gaping maw. Without a second's pause, he leaped into the darkness. The creature was charging across the factory floor, its long, spindly legs eating up the distance. There was no time to think. Chloe screamed as I grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the hole. We threw ourselves into the unknown. The fall was more of a slide. We tumbled down a steep, surprisingly smooth chute, the air growing colder, thick with the smell of ozone and damp stone. We landed in a heap on a level floor in near total darkness. The tunnel we were in was bizarre. The walls weren't rough-hewn rock or reinforced with wooden beams like a mine. They were smooth, almost polished, with a faint, organic-looking texture. It felt less like something that had been dug and more like something that had been grown. "Get up! It will follow!" It was Copper's human voice again, calm and commanding, cutting through the disorienting dark. We scrambled to our feet and ran, our hands trailing along the slick walls for guidance. The geometry of this place was all wrong. The corridor twisted and turned at angles that felt physically impossible. At one point, the floor curved up until we were running along what should have been the wall, yet gravity remained constant, pulling us firmly against the surface. It was a place that defied all known laws of physics, a true labyrinth. The sounds of the chase were just as confusing. The creature's scraping footsteps and furious shrieks would sound as if they were right behind us one moment, then fade to a distant echo the next, only to suddenly seem to come from ahead of us. It was as if space and sound were being bent and folded in on themselves. "What is this place?" Chloe gasped, her voice tight with panic as we ran. "The paths," Copper answered, his breathing even, unlike ours. "Ancient passages. They connect the weak spots. I am a guardian. I was meant to keep this gateway sealed, to keep him contained. But Madigan, he dug too deep. He broke the seal and let it out. It is hungry. It is always hungry." His words hung in the disorienting darkness, a dose of impossible truth in an impossible situation. A talking dog who was an ancient guardian of interdimensional pathways. My mind, already stretched to its breaking point, simply accepted it. There was no room left for disbelief. The monster was smarter than we gave it credit for. As we rounded a sharp, downward-sloping curve, it was there. It hadn't followed us. It had cut us off. It burst through the wall to our right in an explosion of dark crystalline rock, its glowing eyes burning with malevolent intelligence. Before I could react, one of its long, spindly arms shot out, and a three-fingered hand clamped around my right ankle. The cold was instantaneous and absolute. It wasn't just a lack of heat. It was an active, draining force, leaching the warmth and strength from my body at an alarming rate. Pain, sharp and biting, shot up my leg. I screamed a raw sound of terror and agony as it began to drag me backward into the splintered hole from which it had emerged. "Liam!" Chloe shrieked, grabbing my arms, trying to pull me free, but the creature's strength was immense. In that moment, Copper ceased to be a dog. He spun around, and the sound that erupted from his throat was no bark or growl. It was a roar, a sound of primal cosmic fury that shook the very walls of the tunnel. He launched himself at the creature's arm, his jaws clamping down on the desiccated limb. There was a high-pitched shriek of pain from the monster, and a sickening wet crunch. The creature, in its agony, thrashed its arm wildly, slamming Copper against the tunnel wall with brutal force. I heard a pained yelp, followed by a sickening snapping sound, but the dog held on. The creature's grip on my ankle finally loosened as it tried to dislodge the furious guardian attached to its arm. "Go!" Chloe screamed, pulling me forward. "Liam, we have to go!" I scrambled away, my leg screaming in protest. I looked back, my heart tearing in two. I saw Copper still clinging to the monster's arm as it retreated back into the darkness of the wall. I had to help him. I couldn't leave him. But then, a moment later, he emerged from the darkness, limping badly, whining in pain. His front left leg was bent at a horrifying, unnatural angle, and the old wound on his flank had been torn open again, blood matting his copper-colored fur. There was a light ahead, a pale, rectangular shape in the distance, a way out. "The highway," Copper wheezed, his human voice now strained with pain. "It cannot follow into the open, into the light. Go!" Without another thought, I scooped his injured, surprisingly heavy body into my arms. Adrenaline surged through me, overriding the agony in my leg. "Run, Chloe, run!" We ran. We ran towards the light, towards the promise of an exit from this subterranean hell. Behind us, The creature's furious, frustrated roar echoed through the twisting, impossible paths, but it grew fainter with every step we took. We were going to make it. We burst from the tunnel's mouth and collapsed onto a gravelly slope, gasping for air. The exit wasn't a gaping cave, but the concrete mouth of a large drainage culvert, cleverly hidden by overgrown brush. The light wasn't the pale, filtered glow of an Oregon dawn. It was the blinding, relentless glare of a midday sun in a stark white sky. Headlights flashed past, accompanied by the roar of engines and the high-pitched whine of tires on hot asphalt. We were on the shoulder of a massive 4-lane highway, and all around us was desert. Red rock formations jutted up from the baked earth, dotted with saguaro cacti and skeletal-looking shrubs. The air was bone-dry and searingly hot. There was no forest, no rain, no sign of the storm-racked Oregon landscape we had just fled. I scrambled to my feet, my mind reeling from the sheer impossibility of it. I turned and looked back at the dark mouth of the culvert. For a fleeting second, the elongated, horrifying head of the creature emerged from the shadows. It stared out at the bright open space, at the endless stream of speeding 18-wheelers and family cars. A low hiss, a sound of pure, impotent hatred, escaped its lipless mouth. Then, as if physically repelled by the light and the noise of this world, it recoiled back into the absolute darkness of the tunnel and was gone. The weight in my arms shifted. I looked down. Copper was trembling, but not from pain. He lifted his head, looked up at me, and licked my hand. It was a simple canine gesture. The intelligence, the ancient weariness in his eyes was still there, but the channel for his human voice seemed to have closed. His broken leg was still gruesomely real, and blood was still seeping from the wound on his side. But he was, for all intents and purposes, a dog again. Just a dog. A horn blared, startling us. A rusty blue pickup truck had pulled over onto the shoulder a few yards away. A man in a sweat-stained cowboy hat leaned out the window, his face a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Hey, you folks all right?" he called out, his voice a slow southwestern drawl. "You look like you just wrestled with the devil himself. Need a lift?" I looked at Chloe, her face streaked with mud and tears, her clothes torn. I looked down at myself, covered in dirt, holding a bleeding, broken-legged dog. I looked at my own leg, where a hideous, sprawling bruise the color of a deep frostbite was already forming where the creature had grabbed me. I couldn't begin to form the words to explain. "Please," I managed, my voice cracking. "The nearest town, a police station." The man, a farmer named Hank, as we learned, didn't ask any more questions. He helped Chloe into the cab and cleared a space on the seat for me and the injured copper. We drove in a thick, stunned silence, the alien landscape of red rock and endless sky scrolling past the windows. Chloe huddled against me, her body shaking with silent sobs. This wasn't Oregon. This was nowhere we had ever been. The town was a small, sun-bleached strip of buildings that looked like a forgotten movie set. The police station was a single-story cinderblock building with an American flag drooping from a pole out front. The desk sergeant, a beefy man with a drooping mustache, looked up from his crossword puzzle with an air of profound boredom as we stumbled in. His boredom vanished as he took in our state. He listened patiently as I gave him a heavily edited, completely inadequate version of our story. A harrowing encounter with a wild animal, a desperate flight through the woods. He took our names, Liam and Chloe Caulfield, and typed them into his computer. We watched as his face went slack. He stared at the screen, then back at us. He typed again, his thick fingers moving with a sudden urgency. He picked up the phone. "Sheriff, you better get down here," he said into the receiver, his eyes never leaving us. "Yeah. You're not going to believe this. It's them." A few minutes later, a tall, grim-faced sheriff walked in. He looked at us, at Copper lying whimpering at my feet, and then at a printed bulletin in his hand. "Liam and Chloe Caulfield," he said, his voice flat and official. "You're listed on the NCIC database. Federal missing persons." "Missing?" Chloe whispered. "What are you talking about? We just left our house." The sheriff looked at us with an expression that was part pity, part deep suspicion. He gestured to a calendar on the wall behind him, its pages filled with notations and reminders. "According to our information," he said slowly, letting the words sink in, "you two disappeared from your home in Harrow Creek, Oregon, 6 months ago." Time stopped. 6 months. For us, it had been one night. One single, terrifying, endless night. My gaze fell to Copper, curled up by my bruised and aching leg. The world had moved on without us. We had fallen through a crack in reality, and the questions I had weren't about what happened last night. They were about the 6 months we had lost, and the silent, wounded guardian who had pulled us through to the other side. They took us to a small county hospital in Arizona, a place that smelled of disinfectant and quiet desperation. The doctors were baffled. We showed clear signs of dehydration, malnutrition, and exhaustion, consistent with people who had been lost in the wilderness for days. But there were inconsistencies. My leg was the main exhibit. The bruise was a terrifying web-like pattern of black and deep purple, and the skin was unnaturally cold to the touch. The attending physician called it a thermal injury, but couldn't explain how I could have gotten severe frostbite in the middle of the desert. He documented it as unexplained cellular necrosis. Copper was taken to a local vet, who set his leg in a cast and stitched the gash on his side, shaking his head at the strange, serrated edges of the wound. When he was returned to us, he was quiet, leaning heavily against my good leg, a silent, furry testament to the reality of our ordeal. Because we were federal missing persons, they flew in. 2 agents from the FBI, a man and a woman, both dressed in crisp, impersonal suits that looked wildly out of place in the dusty Arizona town. They sat across from us in a sterile interview room, their faces professionally blank. I tried to tell them the truth. I started with the house, the tracks, the sounds. I talked about Alistair Finch and the Madigans. I described the creature, the chase through the impossible tunnels, the talking dog. I watched their expressions shift from professional interest to polite skepticism, and finally, to a carefully concealed pity. I sounded like a raving lunatic. "Meister and Mrs. Caulfield," the female agent, Hansen, said gently. "It's common for victims of prolonged captivity to experience hallucinations. The mind creates narratives to cope with extreme trauma." "We weren't in captivity," I insisted, my voice rising with frustration. "We were in our house until last night. Your house was processed by our evidence response team 5.5 months ago," the male agent Davies countered, his tone flat. "It was empty. There were signs of a forced entry. The front door lock was destroyed. We found the living room in disarray. That's it." "What about the tracks?" I demanded. "The 3-toed tracks?" Davies exchanged a look with Hansen. "Forensics found several unidentifiable impressions in the soil around the property," he admitted, choosing his words carefully. "And some unclassified organic residue on the front porch. The official theory is that it was part of a complex and cruel hoax, possibly perpetrated by the same individuals who abducted you." They believed we were victims of a bizarre rural cult or some backwoods drug operation. They thought we'd been held for 6 months, likely drugged, our minds warped by the ordeal. Our story of a single night of terror was dismissed as a trauma-induced fiction. There was a chasm between our reality and theirs, and it was unbridgeable. No one was ever going to believe us. We were alone with this truth. Eventually, they cleared us. We were victims, not suspects. Under a federal program for victims of violent crime, we were given temporary housing, a small furnished apartment in a bland Phoenix suburb, and some money to get back on our feet. They offered us counseling, which we politely declined. How could we talk to a therapist about a guardian from another dimension? We tried to pretend we were normal. We bought groceries. We watched television. But the normal world felt like a flimsy stage set. Every shadow in a dark corner seemed to elongate unnaturally. Every unexpected noise at night sent a jolt of ice through my veins. The memory of the creature's glowing eyes and the feeling of its life-draining grip were seared into my mind. Chloe barely spoke. She would just sit by the window for hours, staring out at the manicured lawns and identical houses a million miles away. And Copper was just a dog. A very good dog. He was affectionate, loyal, and his leg was healing well. He never spoke again. His barks were just barks. His whines just whines. But sometimes in the dead of night, I would wake up and see him sitting by my bed, not sleeping, just watching me. And in the dim light from the street lamp outside, I would catch his gaze, and for a fleeting moment I would see it again, that ancient, knowing intelligence, that deep, sorrowful wisdom. The guardian was still in there, silent and waiting. He hadn't saved us just to save us. I knew that with a certainty that chilled me to the bone. He had brought us through the rift for a reason. One night, unable to sleep, I sat down at the cheap desk with my laptop. The FBI thought our ordeal was over. I knew it had just begun. My fingers flew over the keyboard, not searching for jobs or news, but for something else. I searched for strange disappearances near old mines, unexplained subterranean humming, folklore about holes in the ground. I found more than I expected. A family of 4 vanishing from a cabin in the Appalachians in the 70s. A group of spelunkers who went into a cave system in Utah and never came out. A small mining town in Colorado that was abandoned overnight in the 1920s. The stories were all different, but they had similar haunting threads. Reports of strange vibrations, unsettling sounds from the earth, and the feeling of being watched. Our house wasn't the only one. Our monster wasn't the only monster. And if the guardian was here, with me, it meant his work wasn't finished. And God help me, neither was mine. My days and nights blurred into a single, obsessive quest. The burnt-out journalist was gone, replaced by a paranormal archivist, a cartographer of fear. I compiled spreadsheets, cross-referencing news articles about unsolved disappearances with geological surveys of abandoned mines and local folklore about hungry ground or the whisperers below. A pattern began to emerge, faint but undeniable. A constellation of tragedy stretching across the country, each one a pinprick of darkness on the map. These were the hot spots. Chloe watched my descent into this new obsession with a quiet understanding. The trauma that had silenced her began to find an outlet. She bought clay and a small, second-hand kiln. She started creating again. But her work was different now. The beautiful, functional pottery she used to make was gone. In its place were dark, twisted sculptures, vessels that looked like screaming mouths, plates etched with designs that mimicked the impossible geometry of the tunnels. Her art was grotesque, disturbing, and profoundly honest. She started selling it online through a specialty gallery, and to our astonishment, people bought it. Her nightmares, given form in clay, were providing us with the financial freedom to pursue my own. It was on a deep web forum, a place where paranoia and genuine insight mingled, that I found him. He went by the username Geodicist, and he spoke about the things I was discovering with a chilling academic authority. He didn't use words like ghosts or monsters. He used terms like non-Euclidean topology, fractures in the local space-time continuum, and points of dimensional abrasion. After weeks of cautious encrypted correspondence, we agreed to meet. He was nothing like I expected. Not a wild-eyed conspiracy theorist, but a soft-spoken, tweed-wearing man in his late 60s named Dr. Eris Thorne. He was a former professor of geology, he explained over coffee in a quiet diner, who had been encouraged to take early retirement from his university for his unorthodox and unfalsifiable theories. He listened to my story, the edited version, leaving out the talking dog, with rapt attention, nodding as if I were confirming long-held hypotheses. Then, he opened his briefcase and spread his own research across the table. They were maps, dozens of them, covered in complex notations. Maps of gravimetric and magnetic anomalies, places where the fundamental forces of the planet seemed to behave erratically. My hotspots, his anomaly zones. They were a near-perfect match. "I don't believe these are natural phenomena," Thorne said, his voice low and intense. "I believe the Earth is riddled with a network of ancient pathways like a cosmic nervous system, and in certain places the barrier between our reality and elsewhere is thin, worn down. I call these places wounds." "Wounds," I repeated, the word feeling chillingly appropriate. "Precisely," he affirmed. "They are openings, leaks, and things can leak through. Things that are hungry, that operate on principles of physics alien to our own." He then looked at me, his gaze sharp and penetrating. My theories were always missing a component, a stabilizing factor. Some legends, the oldest ones, speak of sentinels or wardens that stand guard at these places. Beings that maintain the balance. He called them guardians. On a hunch, I pulled out my phone and showed him a picture I'd taken of Copper, asleep in our apartment, his casted leg propped on a pillow. Thorne stared at the image for a long time, his brow furrowed. "They can wear many skins," he murmured, almost to himself. "A rock, a tree, an animal, a form that can observe without being noticed. But the eyes always give them away. There is an age in them that cannot be faked." As if on cue, a notification popped up on my phone. It was from the smart camera I'd set up in our apartment to keep an eye on Copper. I opened the live feed. Copper was not asleep. He was standing in the middle of the living room, staring intently at the wall. I unmuted the audio. A low, familiar growl vibrated from the phone's speaker. My blood went cold. I looked from my phone to the maps spread across the table. Thorne followed my gaze. "What is it?" he asked. I pointed a trembling finger at one of his maps, at a dense cluster of red circles marking a particularly intense anomaly. "He's looking east," I said. "Toward that." Thorne leaned in, tracing the location with his finger. "Ah," he breathed. "The Blackbriar Hollow, West Virginia. An entire coal mining town that was evacuated overnight in 1957. The official reason was a sudden, uncontrollable mine fire. But there was never any smoke." He looked from the map to my phone, where Copper was still growling at an invisible threat hundreds of miles away. "It seems," Dr. Thorne said with a grim finality, "your guardian is telling you where the next wound is bleeding." In that moment, everything shifted. I was no longer a victim running from a memory. I was no longer a researcher chasing shadows on the internet. I had a map. I had an ally. And I had a silent, wounded partner who was pointing the way. We had a new mission. Not just to survive, but to fight back. The old Ford Econoline van rattled down the interstate, a rolling vessel of scarred survivors. Chloe sat in the passenger seat, a laptop open and glowing, navigating us toward the next point on Dr. Thorne's terrible map. She had become our mission control, our archivist, our link to the sane world we were trying to protect. I was the driver, the field agent, the one who would have to step out of the van and face whatever horrors awaited us. In the back, lying on a pile of blankets, was Copper. Our compass, our Geiger counter for the supernatural. The destination was a ghost town nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, a place once called Blackbriar. A half-century ago, its entire population had vanished between one sunset and the next, leaving behind cold dinners on tables and half-packed suitcases on beds, leaving behind an echo of our own story. Fear was a constant passenger, a cold presence that sat between me and Chloe. The terror of that night in Oregon was a brand on our souls, a wound that would never fully heal. But it was different now. It was no longer the paralyzing fear of the hunted. It was the sharp, focused fear of the hunter, tempered with a grim, world-weary resolve. We were no longer running from the monster in our house. We were driving toward the next one. The closer we got, the more familiar the signs became. The oppressive quiet that fell over the landscape, the unnerving absence of bird song or the drone of insects. A subtle pressure in the air, that same feeling of being watched by unseen eyes from the dense, dark woods that crowded the roadside. In the back of the van, Copper grew restless. He stopped sleeping, pacing in the small space, the soft click of his claws on the metal floor, a constant, nervous rhythm. The hair on his back was perpetually raised. That night, we stopped at a cheap, run-down motel on the edge of the dead zone. The air was thick and humid, heavy with the smell of decay and damp earth. While Chloe was inside, I sat on the tailgate of the van with Copper. The sky was a starless, impenetrable black. I ran my hand over his warm, copper-colored fur, my fingers tracing the faint, puckered line of the scar on his flank. "Why us?" I asked the quiet darkness, the question that had tormented me for months. "Out of everyone in the world, why did you choose us? What are we supposed to do?" Copper just looked up at me with those ancient, sorrowful eyes, then let out a soft, sleepy whine and rested his head on my knee. There would be no easy answers. At dawn, we drove the last few miles. A rusted, bullet-riddled sign read, "Welcome to Blackbriar, population 0. The main street was a portrait of decay. Collapsed storefronts, cars from the 1950s sinking into the earth, nature slowly, relentlessly reclaiming what it had lost. We rolled to a stop in the center of the silent town. I looked at Chloe. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She reached over and squeezed my hand, her grip firm. "Whatever it is," she said, her voice quiet but strong, "we face it together." I didn't know if we would survive this. I didn't know what new, misshapen horror had crawled out of the wound beneath this town. I didn't know if we could make a difference or if we were just fools rushing toward our own destruction. I glanced in the rearview mirror, at the long, empty road we had traveled to get here. The old me, the journalist from Philadelphia, the man who had bought a house in Oregon seeking peace, was a ghost, a distant echo from another lifetime. Now there was only this. The van, the map, the woman I loved, and the silent guardian at our side. There was only the fight. As I killed the engine, plunging us into the profound, waiting silence of Blackbriar, a final, chilling question solidified in my mind, a question that I knew would follow me into whatever darkness lay ahead. Did we ever really escape that house in Oregon? Or has the whole country just become a bigger version of it?